Many years have passed since a fellowship of light battled the shadow creature at the Grey Havens. Now the heroes find themselves in an unknown land where they discover a man in black is wreaking havoc. Undeath follows him wherever he goes, and long-forgotten legends rise again, having been possessed by his evil. Join the players of this Dungeons & Dragons campaign as they attempt to stop the man in black as he collects artifacts both on and off the Lonely Isle. Welcome to Toleracia in Part 2 of the Inglorion Bastards trilogy, Rise of the Mormon.
All right, everybody. Welcome to episode 99 of the Inglorion Bastards podcast. I would say campaign, but this is an interview night, and I look so forward to the interviews. Tonight, I've been waiting 4 months to have this interview. Tonight, I have the privilege of having the Canadian author David Day with me. He's the author of over 40 books, including at least a dozen on J.R.R. Tolkien's myth and stories. He's been writing for over 40 years. And just in communicating with him over the last 4 months, I'm really excited to have him here to tell the stories that he's told to me via email. So welcome to the podcast, David.
Well, thank you, Jared.
And the way I usually start is I ask the person that I'm interviewing to maybe give a little background on yourself and in your case, how you got into writing.
Yes, I guess it was really in the decade after high school. I sort of alternated between universities and logging camps for about a decade. I worked for a good 5 years of that as a lumberjack. But my first serious writing really came as a result of keeping journals while in wilderness logging camps. I had a lot of time in the evenings quite often. Mm-hmm. My first book was was a book of poetry about loggers working on Vancouver Island in northern British Columbia. After that, I did research and edited some magazines on Vancouver Island. Then I worked for a publisher in Toronto, and in 1978 I moved to England, where I was based in London for about 30 years. I traveled around Europe a lot. I lived in Greece and Spain, and I also traveled back and forth from Canada to the United States. But during that time, I've made a living as a professional writer. I've published over 50 books, and they're quite varied, from poetry, fiction, fairy tales, history, ecology, natural history, literary criticism, and mythology. And I've been a newspaper and magazine columnist and written for TV and film. And of course, over the last 40 years, I've published a dozen books on literary criticism on J.R.R. Tolkien. The Tolkien Bestiary came out in 1979. It was the very first illustrated guide to Middle-earth. And so it's the 40th anniversary this year. So that's a little background about it.
Wow, yeah. So I'm curious now, how did you, obviously you lived in, you said London for many years, but how did you first experience Tolkien? When did you first hear about it, read it?
Well, actually, it's curious. I read him really in the late 1960s. Again, it was like when I was working in a logging camp, and it was kind of interesting because I was working these giant cedar forests that really reminded me a lot of Lothlorien. Mm-hmm. And the amusing thing is that today they're and not far from where I worked in logging camps, there's now a tree top motel called Lothlorien, where they live in pods and trees. So I wasn't the only one who thought that way. But I worked, about half the people I worked with were Native Indians, and I found the sort of forest spirits of their mythology very much in tune with both the wonderful and terrible aspects of the spirit of forests in a way. And throughout my childhood, I've always been interested in the mythology of the Greek, Roman, and Norse, particularly, but also American Indian. And there was a sense of connection, I suppose. Then another aspect of it is when I first went to England in 1973 for a while. It was the year of Tolkien's death, and I discovered that my paternal grandfather was born and raised in a rural country inn in Wolverhampton, which was just an hour's drive from Tolkien's childhood home in Sarehole, Birmingham.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some bizarre other connections. I spent quite a bit of time in Oxford and in Bournemouth, where he retired. But also, I was in South Africa for a year, and
Oh, wow.
I lived in Bloemfontein, largely as a wonder. I suspect it was very different when he was there as a child.
Now you mentioned mythology just now, and I have a couple of your books, and I can tell how well versed you are in especially Norse mythology. It looks like. I'm curious. Were you just an avid reader, or do you have background in are you a Norse scholar?
I suppose I'd say the first decade after high school, I sort of split my time between logging camps and libraries at universities, and I took a look. I was always fascinated as a child. I used to get all these 19th century books that were beautifully bound hardcover books with wonderful artwork in them, and I saw Tolkien's work as, I took him at his word that he wanted to create a mythology for England. And I guess that's part of the mission of my writing about Tolkien was that although, like everybody, Lord of the Rings might be a favorite Tolkien book, it was the Silmarillion that when it first came out, that I realized the depth of his work. And the Silmarillion came in 1977, and I did, by 1979, I'd done the Tolkien bestiary. And that was a really attempt to get that kind of medieval feel and look to a book that related it directly to Tolkien. I mean, I've often said, that he wanted to create a mythology that was on par with Greek and Norse mythology. And I sort of see it as the task that he did was unbelievable. That he actually created a mythology out of nothing. I mean, Homer had the whole of Greek mythology and history and literature to back him up. Tolkien had to invent everything. It was like like if Homer had written the Iliad and the Odyssey, he would have had to invent all the rest of the stuff. Tolkien created the entire history of his world, and for 37,000 years before you get to the Lord of the Rings.
Right.
It's an insane thing to do, but it was quite a wonderful, I thought just a wonderful, amazing project to do. And it was something that, actually was beyond his lifetime. I mean, Christopher had to do a lot of the heavy lifting afterwards. And
absolutely.
We must say that it's sad that his Christopher's passing. I mean, we owe a huge debt to him in his gathering of all of Tolkien's stuff. I mean, we wouldn't have the Silmarillion if it wasn't for
right.
him.
And he did it with class and honor.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So it's. I mean, I know he'd sort of just recently fairly retired from doing that work, but we really have to honor him for that. It just gives the depth of what's there is there because of Christopher. Apart from the fact he drew the maps for for Tolkien, for even when the books were being first created, when they did Lord of the Rings, it was Christopher drawing the maps. So it was.
Well, I'm just happy he got to do the Children of Húrin and the Beren and Luthien and the Fall of Gondolin. He got to sort of flush those stories out.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you what your favorite of J.R.R.'s works were, but I think you answered that. You mentioned the Silmarillion. Would you say that is sort of your favorite of all of his writings?
Well, I think the Lord of the Rings is the most fun to read. The Silmarillion really. When the Silmarillion came out in 1977, actually, it had a huge boost of publicity, but it sort of fell flat immediately because people were expecting another Lord of the Rings, and they went, "What the hell is this?" And to me, it was like brilliant because I like a lot of people. I'd read all the Lord of the Rings annex, all the notes at the back and everything, and wondered about all this. And I thought he couldn't possibly have created all this history from through all the Numenorians and the gods and things like that. And just but he did. and when the Silmarillion came out, I thought, wow, it's and that the reason I did the bestiary when I did was because when the Silmarillion came out, it allowed you to explore that whole world. I mean, just the whole of the Undying Lands and all of the prehistoric stories behind Lord of the Rings that explained so much. But it was because I'd read as a child Greek and Norse mythology and a lot of other types of mythology around the world. I was quite taken by the Silmarillion, but I could also see why people would scare people right away who didn't have that kind of background. So I really I felt almost obliged to do what I. The reason I did it as a bestiary form was that I'd taken bibliography courses at universities and had studied older manuscripts, and after the Bible in the Middle Ages, the bestiary was the most popular form because they didn't actually separate sort of elephants from dragons. And they were wonderfully illustrated with beautiful illustrations and everything. And they were the equivalent of a natural history encyclopedia of their time. And I just thought, if I was going to do a reference book on Tolkien, why not do a sort of a medieval approach to it, as these creatures and all these different races of beings and stuff like that. Because I just thought it would be a way of approaching it. And I was very lucky because I got a great designer and great artists to work on it, and they spent an enormous amount of money. I think it was £80,000 on production costs on that book. So it's the only book in the world with that typeface. They made a typeface especially for it because they wanted to have a good that kind of look to it. And they got people like Ian Miller, who is wonderful. I mean, his drawings look like steel engravings, and they fit into this appearance of a kind of medieval manuscript. That I was thinking of how Tolkien created this idea that these manuscripts were written by hobbits and passed on through various ways. I mean, I'd sort of toyed with the idea of saying, this manuscript had just been discovered and it's an old bestiary of Tolkien's world. But
yeah.
But anyway, I was just pleased with the way in which I got a team of artists and stuff that were really into doing it, with that kind of look.
Well, the books are beautiful, especially the two that I have. The first of your books that I picked up was called The Battle of Tolkien, and I remember, anytime I go into a Barnes and Noble, I'll go over to the fantasy section and to the Tolkien wall, and I can usually spot right away any new books, and this beautiful red book stood out, and it's just a beautiful thing. But if I could, you mentioned I think the term reference. Right, a reference book. Was that kind of your primary motivation for writing these books? Was it as a reference for fans?
Well, it was written basically to explore his world. It's interesting that for instance, I sometimes get criticism over, there's a map that I made this 40 years ago, and I'm getting complaints about it at times from people who say, oh, it's not the way we see it, and there's these other maps. Well, this was done 40 years ago, and I at the time, I wanted to have my approach to all these books is that you don't have to speak Elvish in order to understand them. You don't have to, you can be a first-time person coming to Tolkien. You can be people who are widely experienced. I'm approaching it in a way that it is a guide to his world. I think, for instance, there are other guides, but they're not really guides. They're basically indexes that are annotated. You can't orient yourself with it. And so with the bestiary and all the subsequent books, I've tried to give a means of orienting yourself immediately in each one of them, so that you understand the 30. Like it's when I talk about any of the characters, it's within the context of that 37,000 years. So in the context of the parts of the world have disappeared and reappeared, and in fact the world changes entirely. So the first map I did was I pointed out, look at some of Tolkien's maps, and the ones that are in the books, but there weren't very many when I did that.
Yeah.
There was Numenor was mentioned, but nobody knew that it was star-shaped until several books on. In Lord of the Rings, you have no sense of that, and in the Silmarillion, you don't have that. But what I said was, this is to show. I mean, the catchline underneath is that it's the Arda throughout the ages that show you how you can get from like Undying Lands to Middle Earth, and where all these things would occur if you could put them in one map. And I guess the people are saying like 40 years later this this isn't the way we see it, and there's new maps that have come out. Of course there are, but that was a way of orienting people. And I very specifically said that this is a generalized map of through time.
Well, can I read a piece from, I believe it was from your new book, An Encyclopedia of Tolkien. This came from the introduction. It says, this book is intended for those general readers of J.R.R. Tolkien who wish to learn more about the genius behind this awesome body of literature and the origin of some of the author's remarkable ideas, through tracing the source of inspiration in Tolkien's world as well as its shared themes and motives. It is hoped readers may appreciate the archetypal dimension of myth and legend so enthralled Tolkien throughout his life. Anything you want to say about that? Or does it speak for itself?
I would say it tries to, put everything in context. I also it's one approach that I've taken is that I'm taking Tolkien at his word. I'm relating his writing, his characters to those in Arthurian romance, in Norse mythology, and even Egyptian mythology, where he's so widely read. I mean, in terms of his where he's drawing on things. I mean, the whole Numenor is based on the Atlantis legend of Plato, and how all those. I tried it, particularly in the big leather-bound book that I did with on the encyclopedia, is to make that connection with world literature, that he's dealing with an archetypal world that is, in fact, in most of the world's mythologies, and he's created a mythology that is on equal terms with those.
Well, so you did you came out with a book series, right around the time that the movies came out, I believe. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Well, actually, it wasn't. What happened was that about 2002, I had one new book come out that was called The World of Tolkien. But in fact, what happened was that the Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings came out 2001, 2002, 2003, and in 2002 this book came out. But what happened was the 6 previous books, the Tolkien Bestiary, the Illustrated Encyclopedia, Tolkien Companion, Tolkien's Ring, which I did with Alan Lee, and the Hobbit Companion were also just reprinted continuously while those films were on. And it obviously gave it a boost to it. And in fact, I mean, of course, Alan Lee, who I've been friends with for most of my adult life, we did. He was. They tried to commission him for the bestiary, but in fact, he was working on something else. So, but after that, his Ian Ballantyne, who was the first publisher of Tolkien in paperback in America, came to me and said, "Would you like to do this book on castles with Alan Lee, because he really liked what you did on the bestiary." And that led to we met in upstate New York in Woodstock, and that sort of led to a long. We've done I think 5 books together now, and I was the one who actually introduced him. Well, when we did, he wasn't really particularly into Tolkien before that. He was into Celtic mythology, and he did his fairies books. And I got him to do the Tolkien's Ring, that was mostly about the mythological sources of Tolkien, and brought him into HarperCollins. And so they immediately grabbed him up when they saw what he was doing.
Of course.
So and then he also got into film largely because one of my best friends in London is Terry Jones and Michael Palin from the Python.
Really?
Yeah, and they Terry hired him to do a book, a film that was called Eric the Viking.
Oh yeah.
And so he started getting into the film business there, but the Tolkien stuff was something that because he was a little distant from it first, and started to be enthusiastic after that, and subsequently done quite well with it.
Well, you mentioned one of my questions was going to be about any exciting collaborations that you've done in the past, and you mentioned Alan Lee. Yeah. Is it? I believe you mentioned a story about John Howe as well. Do you want to tell that?
Well, John's another Canadian. He's from Vancouver originally, and he approached me about, because he said Tolkien's Ring, the one that I did with Alan, was one of his favorite books. And he asked me to collaborate with him on a TV series he did. It was in French-German production on the Hobbit. That sort of I think it's called Discovering the Hobbit. And he invited me to come with him down the Rhine Valley, and we went from castle to castle along the Rhine and discussed the sort of Germanic roots of Tolkien. And where I said to him, like Middle Earth, the mythology of Germany has a river running through it. And so we had a great time. It was wonderful. We turned up in at least quite often freezing castles, and did just discussing Tolkien and his characters in the context of Germanic mythology. He'd also did one on Icelandic ones and English sources. So he was sort of following the trail I started with Tolkien's Ring, and tracing the story. But we had a really good time. His wife and my wife were there, and we had a terrific time doing that. I mean, I've worked with a lot of different illustrators. I mean, besides Alan and John. I've with Ralph Steadman and Gerald Scarf, who did The Wall with and
Ralph Steadman did Fear and Loathing.
Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, yeah. And a lot of for years I did a lot of journalism on. I was one of the people involved in Greenpeace near the beginning, and I did environmental journalism, and I did a book called The Whale War, and another one called Eco Wars. And I had a big book on extinction of species called the Doomsday Book of Animals, which is all the animals that became extinct after the dodo, sort of.
I feel like that book might it could be longer and longer every day.
Yeah, sadly so. And in fact, I mean, I ended up doing just in 2012 almost an updated version of it. But I had great wildlife artists working on that as well. And the Doomsday Book was the forwards done by the Duke of Edinburgh because he was head of the World Wildlife Fund at that time. And,
Oh, wow.
And it was picked by Time magazine as one of the top 20 books of the year. So that immediately doubled the sales on it.
Yeah, I bet it did. Well, you've been talking about the illustrators that you've worked with in talking with you via email. There are a few other illustrators that I want to ask you about. Before I do that, I'm going to read another quote from, this one is from the introduction of The Battles of Tolkien. This says, for as entertaining as it may be to examine Tolkien's battles as a colorful series of war games, his dramatic account of these conflicts are so much more than variations of battles in a game of Dungeons and Dragons. Well, as it so happens, my podcast is, I like to think of it as more than just Dungeons and Dragons. It's a carefully crafted story woven into Dungeons and Dragons and Tolkien's lore. But you had communicated to me that you had worked with some of these people that had experience.
I didn't mean to denigrate Dungeons and Dragons.
No, I didn't think that at all. No.
The thing is, since when the bestiary came out, it was I kept on getting contacted by dragon masters, dungeon masters, who were informing me that the bestiary was an excellent reference book for them. But I guess I shouldn't have been surprised because Ian Miller and John Blanche who were two of the major artists on the bestiary and in the encyclopedia. They in the 1980s there were games workshops and white editors and were very much involved in that sort of world with the White Dwarf magazine and Warhammer games and models. Ian also worked with he did a lot of the background sets for the sets of Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings film, the animated one. It wasn't a great film, but the backdrops looked good. And then he also worked with Michael Crichton and Guillermo del Toro, who claimed that Miller was one of the great artists of the 20th century. He said Del Toro was really inspired by Miller's art. In the 90s, we had Mel Grant. In the 1990s, was a prominent figure in fighting fantasy game books, but also he did Iron Maiden album covers.
Oh yeah. Now you're talking my language.
Yeah. So there was, and that's the one of the most. This year we also did, looking back 40 years, an illustrated a book about the illustrators over that 40-year period, and it's quite fascinating looking at some of Mel Grant's versions of the Balrog compared to Ian Miller's 20 years before that, and the fantasy art changes through that time. And this new book is a sort of large format one that's the illustrators of Tolkien, and it's quite interesting comparing how all that fantasy art has expanded and changed over that period. One of the great pleasures of my life is actually that most of my books, not just the ones that the 40 others that I wrote, that not besides the Tolkien books, I've always worked with great artists, and it's a real pleasure to be able to give them a vehicle for this their vision and how it, as I say, it's changed over that period of time. But I was going to mention about what you're saying about the series that I did. In the last 5 years, we've done almost a new version of everything with this. In fact, it's coming out next year as a box set of the 6 books that goes from the Tolkien dictionary through, like the one you've seen on the battles.
The battles.
Yeah, it's a 6-volume set, and they're all designed in a similar way with this leather-like covers and everything, and I think the designers did a brilliant job of it, and they have they're sort of a complete reference library of Tolkien from different approaches.
Well, David, I have to ask you. So, in doing research, you had mentioned some of these disagreements with people on maps and various other various things. In doing research about you, I did see some of these disagreements on various websites with Tolkien enthusiasts and including the Tolkien Society.
Yeah.
I know we've talked and it's been upsetting for you. If there's anything that you want to say about this, say what's on your mind.
It's what's interesting is that from what I can determine, it was sort of about the mid 1990s when the internet became quite popular. There was a kind of persistent trolling of my books by about 1% of the reviewers. Most of my books have been reviewed at 4 or 5 star level, but there's always a couple down at the bottom, which I guess you can expect for different things. It's just that it's taken a rather vicious tone. However, I didn't really become aware of it until about a good decade later, in 2008, when I'm sort of not big on media stuff. I didn't really use Google or the internet much before 2008. So unfortunately, I was sort of blissfully unaware of about a decade of abuse. But when I finally got onto Google and looked up the Tolkien Society, I found I'd been blacklisted, which I mean, I really regret this kind of misunderstanding. But it was it was evidently around 2004. I went to a Tolkien conference, and I'd been invited twice before in the 80s and 90s, and gone there without anything. I just happened to be in Oxford and went to it, and I didn't really think that much of it, but evidently it was a time when I was moving between Canada and England, and evidently they'd sent me correspondence that I never received. So there was evidently a fee to be paid. I was totally unaware of this, but it was like 4 years later by the time I found out. And I don't know, it was something that it was almost impossible to fix. And but the point is, that does anybody really think I'd go to blacken my name at the Tolkien Society for not paying a fee? Anyway, the other aspect is you do get crazy people like this guy who put 150 attacked David Day books on Goodreads, and 150 different books. Unfortunately, only 60 of them were my titles. The other 90 blameless David Days who wrote books on carpentry, bulldozing, psychiatry, life of Jesus. Poor guys who got these 1-star ratings and abuse.
Well, the internet can be a good thing and a bad thing sometimes. But I know that, and just in talking with you, I can tell, how frustrating this is and how upsetting, you've dedicated 40 years of your life, about, writing about Tolkien and Tolkien's work. Well, thank you for letting me at least bring that up. Well, I don't want to end on that note. I am curious about what you're working on now. And if there's anything that you're really excited for coming out. I know you mentioned the 5 or 6 volume series.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's great. It's they're doing a box set of 6 of these beautifully designed books. There's also, as I say, like Tolkien. I started with writing poetry, so I've got a selected poems called "Evidence of Life," which is I've done 6 books of poems, and this is sort of like a selected book of poetry, and it comes from a quote. The title comes from a quote by Leonard Cohen, who said, "Poetry is the evidence of life. If your life is burning well, poetry is just the ash." It's a book of ashes, I guess, but it was, and also they're doing a new version of my book on extinction of species called Nevermore. It's just coming out, but for people on here, I think the last of the 6 volumes of Hobbits of Tolkien is coming out, and the box set is coming out as well. So, yeah, that's worth looking forward to.
Awesome. Well, I'll be on the lookout for that.
Right.
David, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
And my pleasure.
All right, and good luck.
You too. You too.
Though this marks the end of the episode, the road goes ever on. Until next time, join us at longwinded.one and consider giving us a review on Apple Music, Spotify, or really whichever platform you choose.